Hello, fellow kin. Welcome back to the channel and welcome to today's episode where we'll be taking a look at the January 2024 Dataslate release, which has finally come out because I think, like many others, we were all expecting it to come out last week on Thursday, which means it pushed back some of my videos for this week. And I was kind of scared it would only come out on Thursday, which means it would be a whole week without videos. But thankfully, they released it today on a Tuesday, and I very quickly jumped on in to read it and put something together for all of you today. With that said, let's jump in and take a look at the update. So the metadata came out today, compiled on January 29th, and we could take a look here at the win rates for Leagues of Votann, and we see that we actually didn't drop that much. I was a little surprised by this. I know that some other people estimated we were sitting at around low 50s, maybe 52%, so I'm a little surprised to see us still at 54%. I would have expected with the release of the Necron Codex that we would have dropped slightly below the 55 that we were sitting at before from late November. But it looks like the dwarves, especially following those LVO lists, are still packing some surprises. Now, 54% is still a pretty scary spot to be in because that means we're right at the top of that sweet Goldilocks zone, which is supposed to be 55 where we were at before on November 20th. It's a weird spot to be in because this means we're probably going to take some nerfs, and we can only hope that they won't bring us down to anything below 50%, seeing as how we're at the top of the ladder right now, bar Necrons and Eldari. Now, I am happy to say that I'm pleasantly surprised with the changes made. In fact, and we'll take a look at this at the end of the video, I was right about one major one, which would be for the Sagittars, and I was pretty close for two others as well. Looking at the points values here, I was a little sad to see just red and no green, and I'll touch upon that in a little bit because I do feel like there could have been a good opportunity here to sort of rebalance a couple of the key units and just incentivize you to take some different HQ choices to fill different roles. But for a faction sitting at 54%, I think we got off pretty okay. Nothing here was surprising to me, and in fact, I do feel like we got off the hook with the bikes, which again we'll talk about in a second. So looking at the Thunderkin in particular here, because this is obviously going to be a big one for us, they did go up in points from 75 points for 3 to 85, and likewise going from 150 for 6 to 170. So going up proportionately 10 per batch of 3 there, taking us up 20 points total. The Thunderkin they're an interesting one for me. I mentioned this in my prediction for the data slate, and I touched upon it in some of my other videos, but I just felt that the reason you took them is because of that potential to swing. And by that, I mean you were able to put out potentially a lot of damage because everything is so swingy, it's so variable. You're rolling D6 shots on the grabs, assuming you're running those, which you probably will be. And at just AP1, you're really hoping that your opponent lets these get through without popping Armor Contempt or benefiting from cover. And if you do get a good number of shots that go through, you will do damage because you're wounding those vehicles on a 2+, which is their intended target. Conversely, they also had play with the same loadout into any elites or infantry because of the blast keyword, which does help to elevate their shooting to deal with any hordes or just larger squads of infantry that might be threatening you. Now that said, 10 points up, I think it's still lenient enough that you will still consider taking these. If you were running Brokir Thunderkin, you'll definitely still be running them now. I wasn't a huge fan of them until I reviewed the LVO lists from last week's episode, where I was kind of surprised by how people were running them, and that there were a few tricks and loadouts I hadn't ever considered. I still think they offer point for point some of the best shooting our army offers, especially if you're trying to lean into a really aggressive shooty archetype. There was a discussion on my other video about this where a few commentators and myself included felt that the reason this unit performed so well at LVO was largely due to player-placed terrain in addition to running max-sized units. All three lists ran 3 squads of Thunderkin, with the most top-performing list running 3 full squads of 6. I do feel like this is how you get the most amount of value out of them by taking so many max squad sizes, because you essentially negate some of that variability by building in some redundancy. Likewise, you also help ensure that you're able to get better angles from different positions coming out of reserves, or, as we saw in the last video, kit them out slightly differently to fill different roles. Now, if you were looking to run a list like that, taking 3 max-size squads, you're actually looking at an increase of 60 points here so far in your list design, which can be quite significant when we consider the update the points data slate had on some of our other key units. One such of those units being the Ioneer Hearthguard. These guys are an absolute staple, and it seems like you will never not see at least one squad of 10 taken in any list. These guys have gone up 10 points for 5, or again, 20 points for 10, going up proportionately. And I do think this was expected, and not much of a surprise. These guys were good at 300. I think they're still excellent at 320. You will take these. Every list runs them, and until we get more units in our range, there is nothing in our list that does as much damage consistently as these guys do. So you will pay the tax of 20 points, or 10 if you're taking 5, and I think you'll still be happy with how they perform and not really feel like it's a hindrance or too much of an investment. Now for the Sagittar. The sweet old Sagittar, who used to be 100 points, has gone up 15% and is now 115 points. What do I think about this? I think I saw this coming. I predicted it in my other video that it'd reach 115 when a data slate came out, and I think this is probably a good spot for it to be in. Already, we started seeing a trend where people were shifting away from the 6 Sagittar spam lists in favor of more diverse units to capitalize on aggressive shooting platforms instead. So 115 doesn't really surprise me. I will say that I'm very disappointed that the Warriors didn't come down. The main reason you would want to take a unit of Hearthkin Warriors, and spoiler alerts, but the next video coming out is the video debut for the unit analysis videos, and it's likely going to kick off with the Hearthkin Warriors, but I'll touch on it a little bit now while we're doing this one. The main reason you would take Hearthkin Warriors is because you want to capitalize on their slow movement by throwing them into a Sagittar and splitting them up in 5s, so it's a lower cost of investment to throw those 5 bodies onto an objective, onto a quadrant of the table, and just give you access to scoring quickly and early. With the Sagittar going up in points 15, and the Warriors not coming down at all to compensate for that, I actually think we're going to see a trend shifting away from Warriors, who are already kind of a little scarce, and more people will instead go towards running Grimnirs in their Sagittars instead. Why is that? Well, because the Grimnir is 45 points cheaper than a squad of 10 Hearthkin Warriors. So now, there was already a debate as to running either Grimnir or Hearthkin Warriors, but I think with the Sagittar going up 15, it's going to be hard to take the 115 or so points from somewhere else in your list, and I think the first thing to go in a lot of people's rosters are going to be a squad of Hearthkin Warriors. I'm really disappointed they didn't come down. I think they should have been at 100 points. It would have incentivized taking them a little bit more. There was a list that LVO did quite well, running 3 squads of 10, but they also ran 3 squads of Grimnir. So an argument could be made as to whether the Hearthkin Warriors were here just because you couldn't run any more Grimnirs instead. Overall, not too surprised to see the Sagittar at 115. I do just wish that the Hearthkin Warriors went down a little bit in price to help compensate for that. Now, I mentioned most lists will go up around 115 points. Let's look at an example and see what I mean. Over here, I took LVO's 5th place list out of 910 players, ran by Sweet Lou. We covered this in depth in my other video that came out last week. But if we look here, we could see this list will go up 125 points because he's running 3 squads of 6 Thunderkin, 1 squad of 10 Hearthguard, and 3 Sagittars. I think this is around a fair estimate as to what we can expect to see across most Votann player lists, especially because most people run more than one 10-man squad of Hearthguard, either through a 5-man or through 2 squads of 10. Typically, you'll also see more Sagittars run as well, which will help bring some points up, even if they're running fewer Broke Your Thunderkin than the 18 in this list. So I guess we have Sweet Lou to blame for this. I'm joking. Now, I mentioned there were some units I wish came down in points, namely the Warriors. I also would have loved to see Uthar the Destined come down because he's just not really played, and already he was kind of taken just for the memes, and I wish he came down just a little bit to help incentivize maybe running him or tweaking his abilities slightly so that there's actually a good debate as to whether you should run him or one of the other characters. And conversely, I'm surprised that the bikes didn't go up in points. I'm pretty happy they didn't, but I'm surprised they didn't go up in points. Everyone was running 3 of these. They're essential for scoring, and I know most people started the edition off with looking to run them as shooting platforms as well, either in squads of 6 or just being very aggressive with them. I do think that the meta has shifted in how people play with this, and they instead keep them backfield and just continuously bring them up into reserves and pop them back down. I think this is how you want to use these. You absolutely need to rely on these for scoring, particularly if you want to shift into a shooting archetype via Brokir Thunderkin. So I'm kind of happy they stayed at 90. Perhaps the balanced data team recognizes that this is one of the best ways for Votann to actually score and move around the table, especially if they're nerfing the Sagittar points, meaning that we're going to be running fewer of them, presumably. Another unit I'm a little disappointed didn't come down in points is the Cal. I quite like the Cal. I think he brings something interesting to the table through his ability to give a Judgment token out and attach to the Hearthguard unit. I covered this fully in my Dataslate prediction video that came out a few weeks ago. But in general, the idea is that if this guy came down in points, making him just a little bit more appealing to run in a list versus perhaps the Einir champion who sits at 10 points less, and if they tweaked the faction ability to be single tokens but 6 instead that you hand out at the beginning of the game, you would get to create some really interesting gameplay mechanics because you would be running this Cal, who essentially generates 1 Judgment token for you every turn, and if you take a Praising Glare, you get to put a second token on any one of the objectives. Which means you can very quickly, if you're running this guy, get several key units across the table up to either 1 or 2 tokens if you've been giving out single tokens. They didn't go that route for rebalancing the army faction rule, and I'm not mad. I won't complain. They didn't nerf it. It stayed exactly the same, which is good. It just kind of reworded it a little bit, is how I interpreted that. So you still get to put your 4 tokens out, and perhaps maybe that's why they didn't decide to change the Cal at all, because he still kind of just fits that role of providing lethal hits if you want to run a unit of Hearthguard with plasma guns. Now, on the topic of enhancements and plasma guns, I am so happy to see this change finally clarified. At long last, much like LVO ruled, we have received an official clarification from Games Workshop that the intent behind abilities such as Grim Demeanor is to apply to the weapon characteristic on the datasheet for the unit's profile. This makes logical sense. I am frustrated that people did not agree with this ruling before because it just makes logical sense. It is baked into the datasheet. And so now at last we have clarification on this, that we can ignore modifiers with our weapons if they're equipped with Grim Demeanor. This is great. This adds a ton of value and playability to Grim Demeanor, and I think it's going to become a staple. We saw with the 3 LVO lists that were the top 3 performers for Leagues of Votann last week, that Grim Demeanor was a staple on all 3 of those lists because of LVO's ruling. Going forward, I think we can expect to see Grim Demeanor taken in every list. It is absolutely critical in a meta where C'tans are running around having your damage characteristics. Overall, a very big win, even if there was no points change here. All we needed was the clarification. Okay, so how close was I in accurately predicting the changes for January's data slate? And it turns out not really, because I thought we'd get some decreases, but for the increases, I was pretty accurate. I predicted that the Sagittar would go up 15 points, which we do see it did. And for the Einir, Hearthguard, and Thunderkin, I was about 5 points off on both of them. A little disappointing, but I don't think it's the end of the world seeing these small increases, as I previously mentioned. In general, nothing too surprising here or crazy or reason to be upset. I honestly think we're fine. We were sitting at 54%. I don't think this is going to have too significant of an impact on us. It will mean we have slightly less things to bring to the table, but our army still functionally plays the same, and it allows us to explore other archetypes, which we saw last week many people have begun doing. I do kind of wish they brought a couple items down in points, but again, too soon to complain. We'll have to see how the faction starts to play now and what new meta emerges from this. All right, everyone, thank you so much for watching. As always, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and I'll catch you all in the next video where we'll be debuting our long time requested unit analysis series.